Chapter 7, US-China Relations and Wars. Both parties in a relationship can choose whether they will have a win-win cooperative competitive relationship or a lose-lose mutually threatening relationship, though it takes both of them to agree on what type of relationship they will have. When two competing entities have comparable powers that include the power to destroy the other, the risks of a war to the death are high unless both parties have extremely high trust that they won't be unacceptably harmed or killed by the other. The trade or economic war. Like all wars, the trade war can go from being a polite dispute to being life-threatening, depending on how far the combatants want to take it. When things are going well, it is easy to keep the moral high ground. However, when the fighting gets tough, it becomes easier to justify doing that which was previously considered immoral, though rather than calling it immoral it is called moral. As the fighting becomes tougher, a dichotomy emerges between the idealistic descriptions of what is being done, which is good for public relations within the country, and the practical things that are being done to win. That is because in wars leaders want to convince their constituents that we are good and they are evil because that is the most effective way to rally people's support, in some cases to the point that they are willing to kill or die for the cause. Though true, it is not easy to inspire people if a practical leader explains that there are no laws in war other than the ethical laws people impose on themselves and we have to play by the same rules they play by or we will stupidly fight by self-imposing that we do it with one hand behind our backs. Classically, the most dangerous part of the trade or economic war comes when countries cut the other off from essential imports. The moves to cut off essential imports from either side would signal a major escalation that could lead to a much worse conflict. Both countries, especially China, are shifting to more domestic production and decoupling. The technology war. The technology war is a much more serious war than the trade war because whoever wins the technology war will probably also win the economic and military wars. The US and China are now the dominant players in the world's big tech sectors, and these big tech sectors are the industries of the future. The Chinese tech sector has rapidly developed domestically to serve the Chinese in China and to become a competitor in world markets. At the same time, China remains highly dependent on technologies from the United States and other countries, for example, semiconductor chips from Taiwan. That makes the United States vulnerable to the increased development and competition of Chinese technologies and makes the Chinese vulnerable to being cut off from American or non-American essential technologies. The United States appears now to have greater technology abilities overall, though it varies by type of technology, and the US is losing its lead. China will probably advance its technologies and the quality of its decision-making that is enabled by them faster than the US will. To fight the technology threats, the United States is responding by preventing Chinese companies, like Huawei, TikTok, and WeChat, from being used in the United States, trying to undermine their usage internationally, and possibly hurting their viability through sanctions that prevent them from getting items needed for production. In any case, there is a tech decoupling going on that is part of the greater decoupling of China and the US, which will have a huge impact on what the world will look like in 5 years. The geopolitical war. Sovereignty, especially as it relates to the Chinese mainland, Taiwan, Hong Kong, and the East and South China Seas, is probably China's biggest issue. As you might imagine, the 100 years of humiliation period and the invasions by foreign barbarians during it gave Mao and the Chinese leaders to this day compelling reasons to a. Have complete sovereignty within their borders, b. Get back the parts of China that were taken away from them, for example, Taiwan and Hong Kong, and c. Never be so weak that they can be pushed around by foreign powers. Over the last few years, Chinese influence over other countries has been expanding while US influence has been receding. That is also true in multilateral organizations, for example, the United Nations, the IMF, the World Bank, the World Trade Organization, the World Health Organization, the International Court of Justice, most of which were set up by the United States at the beginning of the American world order. As the United States has been pulling back from them, these organizations are weakening and China is playing a greater role in them. Over the next 5 to 10 years, in addition to there being the decouplings in other areas, we will be seeing which countries align themselves with each of these leading powers. Beyond money and military power, how China and the US interact with other countries, i.e., how they use their soft powers, will influence how these alliances will be made, i.e., style and values will matter. For example, over the last few years I have heard leaders around the world describe both countries' leaders as brutal, which is creating increased fears that they will be punished if they don't do exactly what these two countries' leaders want, and they don't like it to the point of being driven into the other's arms. The capital war. The two main capital war risks are being shut off from capital, which is a greater risk for China than it is for the US, and losing one's reserve currency status, which is a greater risk for the US than for China. The goal is to cut the enemy off from the capital that the enemy needs because no money equals no power. The United States has by far the greatest arsenal of sanctions. Most importantly, the United States has the greatest influence over the global financial system and it has the world's leading reserve currency. Because financial market sanctions are so effective, they naturally lead those countries that are most likely to be harmed by them to work on approaches either to get around them, for example, by developing an alternative payment system, or to undermine the United States' power to impose them. Whatever progress will be made to have China's currency as a broadly accepted reserve currency at the expense of the dollar will take time and should be viewed as part of the big decoupling phase of the relationship that will take place over the next 5 years. The United States' greatest power comes from being able to print the world's money, i.e., from having the world's leading reserve currency, and all the operational powers, for example, influences on the clearing system, that go along with that. The United States is at risk of losing some of this power while the Chinese are in the position of gaining some of it. The most often asked question regarding the dollar is, how could the United States lose its reserve currency status when there are no good alternative currencies to replace it? So let's look at that question more closely. History has shown that whenever currencies are not desired, they are sold off and devalued with the capital finding other investments, for example, gold, silver, stocks, property, etc., to go into, so there is no need to have an attractive alternative foreign currency market to go into for the devaluation of a currency to occur. In other words, the US could see its reserve currency status reduced without there being an alternative reserve currency to go into. Without the US disrupting China's currency and capital markets, they will likely develop quickly and increasingly compete with the US currency and credit markets. You won't see this all at once, but you will see it evolve that way at a shockingly fast pace over the next 5 to 10 years. It seems likely that American policymakers will be forced to choose between A, trying to disrupt this evolutionary path by becoming more aggressive with their wars, in this case via a more aggressive capital war, and B, accepting that evolution will likely lead to China becoming relatively stronger, more self-sufficient, and less vulnerable to being squeezed by the US at the expense of US leadership in this area, especially over the next 5 to 10 years. The military war. It is impossible to visualize what the next major war will be like, though it probably will be much worse than most people imagine. Based on what we do know, the headline is that A. The United States and China's geopolitical war in the East and South China Seas is escalating militarily because both sides are testing each other's limits. B. China is now militarily stronger than the United States in the East and South China Seas, so the US would probably lose a war in that region, while C. The United States is stronger around the world and overall and would probably win a bigger war, though D. A bigger war is too complicated to imagine well because of the large number of unknowns, including how some other countries would behave in it and what technologies secretly exist. The only thing that most informed people agree on is that such a war would be unimaginably horrible. A. China's rate of improvement in its military power, like its other rates of improvement, has been extremely fast, especially over the last 10 years, and B. The rate of progress in the future is expected to be even faster, especially if its economic and technological improvements continue to outpace those of the United States. Some people imagine that China could achieve broad military superiority in 5 to 10 years. As for potential locations of military conflict, Taiwan, the East and South China Seas, and North Korea are the biggest hot spots, and India and Vietnam are the next biggest. The culture war. Chinese culture compels its leaders and society to make most decisions from the top down, demanding high standards of civility, putting the collective interest ahead of individual interests, requiring each person to know their role and how to play it well, and having filial respect for those superior in the hierarchy. They also seek rule by the proletariat, which in common parlance means that the benefits of the opportunities and fruits of productivity created are broadly distributed. In contrast, American culture compels its leaders to run the country from the bottom up, demanding high levels of personal freedom, favoring individualism over collectivism, admiring revolutionary thinking and behavior, and not respecting people for their positions as much as for the quality of their thinking. These core cultural values drove the type of economic and political systems they chose. The only real rule in international relations is that there are no rules. That is because internationally there are no mutually agreed upon laws, no police, no courts, no judges, and no other protocols that are followed in order to judge what's fair and what's not fair and to penalize those who are playing unfairly and are more powerful than the individual powers. What counts most is whether you win or lose. Winning means getting those things that are most important without losing those things that are most important to us, so wars that cost much more in lives and money than they provide in benefits are stupid. It is far too easy to slip into stupid wars, i.e., wars that cost much more in lives and money than anyone sensible would say they're worth, because of a. The prisoner's dilemma, b. the tit-for-tat escalation process, c. the costs of the declining power backing down, and d. misunderstandings existing when decision-making has to be fast. The smartest way to fight and win a war is to outcompete the opposition in order to have the power to negotiate with them from a position of strength. End of chapter 7.